Hello, everyone. A very warm welcome to you all, as this is the third episode of the series Female Composers, a music podcast with a pinch of history. As always, it's Aleksandra Bobrowska speaking, sitting so far by the microphone, but I will soon move over to my home piano to play for you a bit. However, before that happens, let me introduce today's episode, as I can hardly wait for all the musical wonders awaiting us in a minute. The subject of today's episode, or I should probably better say, the life story of today's composer, is the perfect example of how useless it can be to try to categorize people based on their origins or nationality. Basically, you probably admit also that it's quite useless to categorize people based on any other criteria, as the story of today's composer unites together significant Polish, British, Belgian, and French elements. And her life journey, thanks to such a mixture, is so wonderful. It's also difficult to definitely characterize her diverse body of work, a large portion of which has unfortunately been lost, as it's often the case with female composers. To top it all off, she used several different surnames to sign her compositions throughout her life, making her a true enigma worthy of a seasoned detective. Before we all dive into the story of Poldowski, or I should probably say Irena Wieniawska, as this was her true name, I should mention that this series is made possible thanks to a scholarship from the Ministry of Culture and National Heritage of Poland. Let's begin today's journey. Poldowski, or I should probably say more accurately, Irene Regine Jessie Maria Wieniawska, was born in Belgium in Ixelles, nearby the capital city, Bruxelles, on May 16th, 1879. Her mother was the English aristocrat Isabella Bessie Hampton Wieniawski, a niece of the Irish pianist and composer George Alexander Osborne, while her father was the Polish violinist and composer Henryk Wieniawski. Although I have just given our composer's official date of birth, there is some uncertainty surrounding it. In a later application for British citizenship for her daughter, Irene's mother listed the birth year as 1880, rather than the officially accepted 1879. She may have simply made a mistake, or, for reasons known only to herself, wished to formally make her child appear a year younger. We will likely never solve this mystery, but taking that opportunity, I would like to tell you a short story about Irene's parents. Some of you may be familiar with the famous anecdote concerning a piece for violin and piano by our composer's father, Henryk Wieniawski, titled The Legend, Opus 17, which he dedicated to his wife, though, to be more specific, she was still his fiancée at the time of its composition. Henrik reportedly used this piece to soften the heart of his future father-in-law, who had initially opposed his daughter's marriage to a musician. Upon hearing the beautiful, melancholic melody, the father supposedly changed his mind and agreed on the wedding. Unfortunately, the story surrounding the legend Opus 17 is most likely, fittingly enough, nothing more than only a beautiful legend. In reality, the future father-in-law's heart was won over by the news that Henrik had secured a steady job and had taken out a substantial insurance policy for Isabella in the event of his sudden death. These were two conditions firmly laid down by the future father-in-law, who viewed the world of musicians and artists with considerable skepticism. As it later turned out, these demands were not unfounded. Poldowski's parents were married on August the 8th, 1860, in Paris. The bride was escorted down the aisle by the renowned pianist and composer Anton Rubinstein, who had introduced the couple in the first place, while the composer Gioacchino Rossini served as one of the witnesses. Isabella and Henrik had 8 children, 5 of whom survived to adulthood. The youngest of them was Irena, the composer who is the subject of our story today. Sadly, she had no memory of her father, who died suddenly on March 31st in 1880 while performing in Moscow. Irena was just over 10 months old at the time. Yet, she was the only one of Wieniawski's children to pursue a career in music and become a really great composer. Irena Wieniawska was interested in music from an early age and made her first attempts at composition while still a young girl. Her first work, Oriental Suite, written when she was only 9, is considered lost, and this is a really sad news because I would love to hear it. She grew up in Brussels, where the Wieniawski family had moved in 1874 after her father, Henryk Wieniawski, accepted a position of a violin professor at the local conservatory. As a child, she also visited London, where her maternal grandparents lived. Biographers are not entirely certain how long Irena studied at the Brussels Conservatory. She was likely admitted at the age of 12, though her education was largely based on private lessons when she was a young girl. She played the piano and studied both violin as well as composition. It's highly probable that one of her teachers was her uncle, Józef Wieniawski, a pianist and composer who had been a professor at the Brussels Conservatory since 1878. Wieniawska was a talented student. As a teenager, she was already performing her own compositions in public, a fact noted by the English tenor Gervase Elwes in a letter to his wife following one of her concerts. He wrote, and here I quote an excerpt from a fascinating article about Poldowski by Maryna Terlecka. Unfortunately, I'm afraid it's only available in Polish. And here is the quote. Wieniawska, the daughter of the renowned Polish composer, was asked to perform 2 or 3 of her own compositions. Outstanding original works, a very beautiful song, a romance too, and the Danse Indienne, perhaps slightly less magnificent. But it was truly extraordinary to see and hear her. She's a born actress with a touch of genius that has left its mark on her compositions. When Irena, the youngest member of the family, was 17, by then a well-educated young teenager, the family moved to London. There she continued her musical studies in piano and composition while also publishing her own works with the Chapel Publishing House. The first release, appearing in 1900, was a collection bearing the simple, descriptive title, 2 Songs. It contained 2 songs, set to English lyrics. The first one titled Oh, Let It a Solid Ground, based on a poem from Alfred Tennyson's Maud, and the second one, Down by the Salley Gardens, with lyrics by William Butler Yeats. Let us now listen to that second song performed by the British Greek soprano Danae Eleni. The recording dates from 222 and was made at the Fryderyk Chopin Birthday Festival in Warsaw. The lyrics to Down by the Salley Gardens were a popular choice for song settings. Composers such as Herbert Hughes, Rebecca Clark, John Ireland, and even Benjamin Britten incorporated them into their own works. However, let's go back to the life story of Poldowski. Shortly after the songs were published, Irena married Sir Aubrey Edward Henry Dean Pole, a British aristocrat, soldier, and an amateur singer. She met him through a mutual acquaintance, the singer Nelly Melba, whom she had known since her time in Brussels. The couple had their wedding on October 16, 1901, at St. Mary Abbot's Church in Kensington. Subsequently, the composer adopted British citizenship and the title Lady Dean Pole. Their marriage was deeply intertwined with the arts. Her husband occasionally performed as a baritone at his wife's concerts under the pseudonym Edward Ramsay. They had 3 children, though their lives proved to be exceptionally turbulent and tragic. Their firstborn son, Aubrey Donald, died at just 2 years of age, a loss that devastated Irena. Their second son, Sir Brian Dean Paul, became an eccentric member of the Bright Young Things, a group of aristocrats and young socialites who dominated the British tabloids in 1920s and 1930s London with their extravagant antics. Brian suffered from a severe opium addiction and alcohol abuse, often falling asleep in random places, which earned him the nickname Napper. Meanwhile, their youngest child, Brenda Dean Paul, gained fame as a silent film actress and an icon of the London bohemian scene in the 1920s. She, too, was, like her brother, a part of the Bright Young Things. Her life was ultimately ruined by high-profile scandals and a profound drug addiction. In 1935, she published a book titled My First Life, a biography, in which she describes not only her struggles with various addictions and her life story, but also speaks of her mother, Irena. Irena Wieniawska herself at that time would soon face a divorce. She was also destined to change the course of her life. Yet, before all that happens, let us stay with her a moment longer in the days of her early youth, the beginning of her beautiful marriage, and the period of her further studies in Paris, a subject we shall talk about shortly. Irena Wieniawska's studies in Paris, undertaken twice over the course of several years at the beginning of the century, marked a pivotal stage in the development of her unique musical language. By the way, the interruptions were caused by, among other things, the death of her first child and the births of her subsequent children. During her stay in Paris, she mastered her craft under the guidance of distinguished teachers, among them André Gedolge, who was the counterpoint and composition professor, and later continuing her education at the prestigious Schola Cantorum de Paris under Vincent d'Indy. Her time in the French capital coincided with the flourishing of musical impressionism, and Wieniawska drew deep inspiration from the works of Claude Debussy, Gabriel Fauré, Maurice Ravel, and obviously she took a lot from the French symbolist poets. Above all, the Parisian period helped the artist gain a refined sense of tone color and a technical freedom that enabled her to break away from traditional academic constraints. It was there, too, that her fascination with the poetry of Paul Verlaine took root. Her masterful musical settings of his verses, comprising dozens of songs, earned her international acclaim and established her as one of the most compelling composers of her era. Over time, her career and concert schedule gained significant momentum, entering a phase of major success and cementing her position as one of the most original figures on the European music scene. Between 1911 and 1914, she returned to Brussels for a series of acclaimed concerts organized by the prestigious avant-garde association La Libre Esthétique. By the way, she would have continued if not the outbreak of the First World War. This unique association called La Libre Esthétique, led by the critic Octave Moss, shaped a style of symbolism and impressionism. This influence bore fruit in outstanding vocal works dedicated to Moss and his wife Madeleine, her neighbors, and devoted friends living in Brussels. However, a true breakthrough on British soil came with her monographic recital at London's Aeolian Hall in 1912, where distinguished singers such as Maggie Tate and Gervais Elwes performed her songs set to the poetry of Paul Verlaine. From that time on, her output, regularly published by the renowned Chester Publishing House, included such exquisite miniatures as L'air exquise, Dansons la gigue, Mandoline, Spleen, Colombine, and Effet de neige, as well as the piano collection called Caledonian Market. She also gained a powerful ally in Sir Henry Wood. This famous conductor included her orchestral works in the programs of the celebrated Proms concerts at Queen's Hall. These successes were further solidified by the staging of her symphonic opera Silence at the Duke of York's Theatre in 1920. At the turn of 1921 and 1922, the artist decided to perform in the United States. And here a little remark, because there are several musicologists writing about Poldowski, and they cannot entirely agree on the exact date when she went to the United States, but it was around 1920 sometime. This trip was driven by a desire to conquer a new market and an urgent need for complete financial independence, as her marriage was falling apart, and maintaining the extravagant lifestyles of her two adolescent children in London required vast sums of money. Although a joint tour with Gervais Elwes, the singer we've mentioned here several times, that was originally scheduled for 1921 was tragically cut short by his horrible accident in Boston, Poldowski pressed ahead with her artistic plans. While a more extensive tour had initially been planned, her concert activities ultimately centered on New York, where her compositions attracted significant critical interest. On April 22nd, 1921, she gave a recital at the Town Hall, one of the highlights of her visit. The concert took the unique form of a literary musical performance dedicated to the French poet Paul Verlaine. The event was organized in collaboration with Cécile Sartoris. The program was divided into 3 parts, illustrating the stages of the poet's life and his spiritual evolution. Sartoris read biographical excerpts and poems, while Poldowski accompanied the reading by performing her own songs set to Verlaine's texts by the piano. The repertoire included, among other works, the famous Trois Mélodies sur des Poésies de Paul Verlaine. Later, on January 7th, 1922, she also performed at the Princess Theatre, where she presented a cross-section of her piano and vocal works to the New York audience. After an eventful period in the United States, she returned to London in 1922 and ultimately separated from her husband. To meet the financial demands of living independently, Poldowski took a bold step entirely outside the frames of music industry by opening her own luxury fashion boutique in London. There, she created original haute couture collections, dressing members of the British aristocracy and stars of the theatre world. Running this prestigious fashion business allowed her to maintain her high social status and cover the costs of life in London without abandoning her art. During this major phase of her life, her new home became one of the capital's artistic salons, regularly hosting figures such as, for example, George Gershwin or Arthur Rubinstein. The composer also launched an influential series of afternoon chamber music concerts at the Hyde Park Hotel, titled The International Concerts of La Libre Esthétique, in direct homage to her experiences in Belgium. As noted on the website of the Henryk Wieniawski Music Society, Irena Wieniawska also wrote short stories which she sold to earn extra income. After 1921, 5 essays on musical topics were published. The journal Music and Letters published 2 pieces signed by Irene Dinpol. The first, titled Musings, discusses the roles of rationalism and idealism in composition, while the second, Verlaine, deals with Wieniawska's fascination with the poet's work. The periodical, the Chesterian, published 3 further essays under the pseudonym Poldowski. The first one, Man and Modernism, addressing modernist trends in composition through the example of an allegorical story about Adam and Eve. The second one, Poème Aristophanesque, concerning the poet-composer relationship. And the third one, The Influence of Jazz, in which the author attacks the then popular trend of incorporating jazz techniques into classical works. According to David Mooney, who is an international authority on the life and works of Poldowski, these essays are, and here the quotation, despite their brevity, remarkably intelligent and thought-provoking. In the absence of Wieniawska's diaries and letters, they provide key source material offering insight into the mind of this enigmatic woman. I would like to pause here for a moment and share 2 quotes from the previously mentioned biography of Poldowski's daughter, Brenda, titled My First Life. Unfortunately, this book is not available for general access or purchase. Only a few copies can be found in selected library reading rooms across the UK. However, the Henryk Wieniawski Music Society has published 2 beautiful excerpts on its website. Please listen to how Brenda perceived her mother and how she described her to us. delicate, slender, and exotically beautiful, my mother grew into a promising professional pianist of great brilliance. With skin as white as magnolia, with almond-shaped eyes, and dark, straight hair like a Japanese woman's, she was admired by many for her extraordinary, almost oriental beauty. She possessed a very delicate figure, while her talent and originality in dress were ahead of her time. She was an excellent artist, generous, inventive, witty, and intelligent, with a steadfast capacity for reasoning and perception worthy of any man. From the very beginning, she was a unique paradox and my ideal of womanhood. I remember her sitting in the boudoir with its small windows overlooking the cherry orchard, writing an orchestral score without the aid of a piano. Almost all of her works were completed this way. She used to say she could hear all the sounds of all the instruments. Brian and I would pester her with silly, childish questions. It never bothered her. In fact, she rarely even noticed. Pen in hand, a cigarette, always a cigarette, dangling from her lips. She would look up without a trace of a grimace and ask, "What is it, darling?" Never irritated, rarely impatient. In the late 1920s, Poldowski was forced to abandon her concert career entirely due to rapidly deteriorating health. She suffered from severe pneumonia, which led to serious complications. She underwent complex surgery that resulted in the removal of her right lung. Worn down by illness and struggling with financial difficulties as well as her two adult children's drug addictions, she spent her final months in solitude. She died suddenly of a heart attack in London on January 28, 1932, at the age of 52. She suffered from the same heart condition that had claimed the life of her father, Henryk Wieniawski, prematurely. She was laid to rest in the family tomb at Brockwood Cemetery, near London. Her operatic and symphonic works have all but vanished. Only a few dozen of her songs, along with a handful of piano and chamber miniatures, have survived to this day. On her deathbed, she reportedly said, "Do look after my music." Yet her children, physically and mentally shattered by their addictions, were unable to do so. I quietly do hope that one day we might rediscover some of her compositions currently considered lost. Perhaps they are still waiting patiently in a library archive or an attic somewhere. it would be wonderful if that wish could come true.
Down by the Salley gardens, my love and I did meet. She passed the Salley gardens with little snow white feet. She made me take life easy as the leaves grow on the tree. But I, being young and foolish, with her did not agree.
We are slowly reaching the end of our story today. Before I bid you farewell, however, I would like to take a moment for a musical interlude featuring 4 songs and also explain how Irena Wieniawska signed her works, something I haven't mentioned yet today, but which is fascinating and, frankly, quite confusing on her part. You see, over the years, she signed her compositions using her maiden name or her husband's aristocratic surname after marriage, or, most notably, the popular male pseudonym Poldowski, which is the name I have primarily used when speaking about her in this podcast. This pseudonym appeared in various forms: Poldowski, Poldowska, Madame Poldowski, and it was under this name that she published the majority of her major works. In her youth and at the start of her creative career, she signed her work as Irena Wieniawska, Regine Wieniawski, Irene Wieniawska, or Irene Regina Wieniawski, or Irene Regina Wieniawski. I'm not sure actually what language she was thinking about when signing her particular names. After marriage, she used her aristocratic titles: Lady din Pol, Lady Irene din Pol, or Lady Irene Poldowski Pol. What a mixture. Now that we have cleared that up, it's high time to move on to our musical part. A Poor Young Shepherd is one of the most distinctive works in Poldowski's compositional output. Composed in Paris in 1912, though later London editions date from 1924, it stands as a classic example of vocal lyricism. Despite its English title, the text is written entirely in French. The lyrics are taken from a poem by the French symbolist Paul Verlaine, obviously, the favorite poet of Poldowski, and it can be found in the collection Romance sans parole, originally published in 1874. Verlaine, captivated by English culture and landscapes during his travels, gave the poem an English title to evoke the character of a traditional pastoral ballad or a stylized folk song. The poem, opening with the lines Je perds d'un baiser comme d'une abeille, I fear a kiss like a bee, tells the story of a young, shy, and naive shepherd in love with a mysterious girl called Kate. Although Valentine's Day is approaching and the girl has been promised to him, the young man is terrified to reveal his feelings to her. The lyrics represent one of the lightest and most innocent texts by Verlaine that Poldowski chose to set to music. And I would love to share with you the English translation of this beautiful and charming text. A poor young shepherd. I'm afraid of a kiss, as if it were a bee. I suffer, stay awake, and I get no relief. I'm afraid of a kiss. Yet I truly love Kate, with her eyes so lovely. She's so delicate, her long face so pallid. Oh, how much I love Kate. It is Saint Valentine. I must. And yet I haven't dared tell her in the morning. This so terrible word called a Saint Valentine. To me, she's promised. How fortunate I am. Yet what labor it is to be a loving man near a promised woman. I'm afraid of a kiss, as if it were a bee. I suffer, stay awake, and I get no relief. I'm afraid of a kiss. I hope that you did enjoy the funny and charming text of The Poor Young Shepherd. Right now, we are going to speak about love again, but from a completely different angle. The song Spleen by Poldowski, composed in 1913, is an outstanding work inspired, again, by the poetry of Paul Verlaine. And it reflects the decadent atmosphere of the turn of the century. The poem's text describes the fear of rejection, while its translation presents an impassioned declaration of love. And that's how it sounds like. Spleen. All the roses were red, and the ivy was all black. Dear, at your slightest move, all my despair revives. The sky was too blue, too tender, the sea too green, the air too mild. I always fear, to wait and wonder, one of your agonizing departures. I'm weary of the glossy holly, of the gleaming box tree too, and the boundless countryside, and everything, alas, but you. So right now we have arrived to a much brighter, much more sunny bit of Poldowski's musical heritage. The piece called Dimanche d'Avril is based on a poem that comes from the collection Sagesse, which means wisdom, obviously by Paul Verlaine. It was too written during the poet's stay in England, like The Poor Young Shepherd, hence the landscape filled with elements characteristic of the British Isles, you will hear soon in the text. Thanks to its remarkable atmosphere, the piece inspired various composers, among them Claude Debussy, who created a famous song based on it. Irena Wieniawska, Poldowski, published a musical setting of this poem in London in 1911 under the title Dimanche d'Avril. And this poetry and its translation is a real challenge for someone who is not an English language speaker. So excuse my English, but if it doesn't work well, perhaps it will also help you to find it in the original Sagesse book of poetry by Paul Verlaine, and will help you to get to know his beautiful poetry this way. But without further ado, let's try. The hedgerows stretch out, frothing afar, sea-like, and clear in the clecker mist, fragrant with young berries. Trees and windmills rise, insubstantial on the delicate green, where agile colts come to stretch and frolic. On this lazy Sunday, some large ewes, soft as their white wool, join them in their play. Just now there broke a curling wave of flute-like bells in the milky white sky. I really do hope that at least most of the poem that you've just heard was understandable. It's incredible how much new vocabulary one discovers when reading poetry, because reading articles from newspapers and contemporary books doesn't give as much variety as poetry, especially if it's not written currently. So I do encourage you to embark on this journey. If English is not your first language, this is definitely the best path to improve as much as possible. But before we move on to the final musical piece, I will just say a few words about it. It's called Colombine, and it was set to the poem by Paul Verlaine. There is no surprise about it. This poem, also called Colombine, talks about typical figures from the Italian Commedia dell'arte. So there is Colombine, Arlequin, Pierrot, Leandre, and they usually have very typical roles assigned to particular characters. At the same time, in Verlaine's poetry, they just turn completely mad. To be honest, the picture he presents in his verses talks about complete madness and cruelty. Colombine is a character that typically is beautiful and clever, but in his vision, she's so cruel and she has perverse green eyes. And actually, to be honest, she disrespects all the characters that appear in the text and who are absolutely in love with her. Arlequin, in classical comedy, he's a cunning servant dressed in a diamond-patterned costume. Here, he's actually in a wild costume with eyes gleaming sinisterly from behind his mask. Pierrot, normally a melancholic, unhappy in love with Colombine, obviously. In this piece, he actually performs some nervous, even grotesque leaps just to catch Colombine's attention. And Leandre, he is directly, simply labeled as a fool in this poetry. So I think the vision of Verlaine is really dark and completely different from what we are used to in Commedia dell'arte. At the same time, Poldowski's music matches the character so well, and it's so beautifully done. I hope you will enjoy this last piece for today's podcast. I will only add that it was performed in Warsaw in 2019 by Duo ALDICE. Duo ALDICE, it means Candice, Ielo, voice, and Aleksandra Bobrowska, piano. Let's enjoy this beautiful piece of music, and I will see you soon in the next episode.